possible that the Ukrainians, with the extra assistance from the U.S. and Europe, can blunt Russian land offensives this fighting season and can degrade the Russian position generally by hitting them behind the lines. If they do that, the Russians may suffer casualties. Putin's desire for a win this year will be blunted, frustrated, and things by the time of as early as the NATO summit in Washington, better for Ukraine.
The Prime Minister's pledged to increase UK spending on defence to 2.5% of GDP by 2030 was accompanied by his announcement of a further £500 million of British military support for Ukraine, including 400 vehicles, 1,600 munitions and 4 million rounds of ammunition. And it comes as the US Senate is expected to approve a $60 billion package of military aid for Ukraine, which was approved by the House of Representatives at the weekend after months of delay. Well, some Republicans opposed the deal. Earlier on Times Radio, Republican Senator Ron Johnson said the US should secure its own borders first.
I'll be voting no. And it's not that I don't have a great deal of sympathy for the freedom-loving people of Ukraine who've been invaded by a war criminal, Vladimir Putin, or the people of Israel who endured a horrible slaughter, brutal slaughter at the hands of Hamas, or the people of Taiwan who are being threatened by China. The problem is this is money we don't have. This isn't exactly coming from U.S. taxpayers right now. This is borrowed money. This is plundering our children's future. And we're not recognizing the reality, particularly in the Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin will not lose this war. And the other reality is there's very little push from my constituents to provide funding to help other countries secure their borders when we haven't first secured ours. And that was our first bottom line.
Well, how much difference will the latest package of US aid make to Ukraine's efforts to prevent Russian forces gaining more of its territory? Daniel Fried is a former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and a former US ambassador to Poland. Good evening to you, Daniel.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Well, really good to have you with us. It looks as though the Senate will approve this latest package of aid for Ukraine, something that President Zelensky has been saying his forces desperately need. The House of Representatives, of course, did vote it through finally at the weekend. How significant a move do you think this will be?
Well, giving no further assistance would have been a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. And all of our problems in Europe and the United States would be worse if Ukraine lost, and that was the danger. Now, the assistance gives the Ukrainians a fighting chance, so to speak, for relative success. Much depends on how fast the U.S. can provide Ukraine with the arms and what kind of arms. In particular, are we, the Americans, going to give the Ukrainians the longer-range Attacker missiles, which would enable them to put more of Russian military infrastructure and bases inside Ukraine, especially at risk. So it is possible that the Ukrainians, with the extra assistance from the U.S. and Europe, can blunt Russian land offensives this fighting season and can degrade the Russian position generally by hitting them behind the lines. If they do that, the Russians may suffer casualties. Putin's desire for a win this year will be blunted, frustrated, and things by the time of as early as the NATO summit in Washington, better for Ukraine. So I'm not saying Ukraine will win with the assistance, but they have a reasonable chance, and the Biden administration people I speak to are operating on we have to be forward-leaning. We and the Europeans help the Ukrainians make the most of this new opportunity.
We're having a little bit of difficulty with your line. We'll stick with it for a moment and see if it stabilizes. President Biden, as I understand it, has given assurances that the US will send supplies as quickly as possible. But I mean, in the past, it has taken quite some time to actually get supplies from the point where they're agreed in the US political system to actually getting them delivered. And I mean, Russian forces have been gaining Ukrainian territory, haven't they?
You're right. The Ukrainians have been on the defensive. They've been losing ground. The administration people.
Oh, we seem to be losing Daniel Fried. We are just going to see if we can get a better connection so that we can hear what Daniel is saying, because the US Senate is now expected, perhaps even later tonight, to approve that big package of aid. There is money for Israel, there is some money for Taiwan, and there is that $60 billion of military support for Ukraine. And I should say that we're also hearing that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who was in Poland earlier, is going to be in Germany. He's arrived there tonight, and he's going to be talking about the UK and Germany opening a new chapter in defence partnerships. We've got Daniel Fried back. Daniel, the question is, I mean, how quickly can that military support get through? Because the President Zelensky has been warning that Russia is gaining ground.
You're absolutely right. The administration has had time to prepare, and it would be inexcusable if, following the vote, the weapons didn't move quickly. But I am assured by people in the administration that they are prepared, they are ready to move the weapons quickly, which needs to happen. The faster, the better. You're absolutely right.
And we've had the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, today announcing an increase in Britain's defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. He's also announced a further package of British aid to Ukraine. And it comes at a time when, as we were hearing from a defence expert earlier in the programme, it does look as though Europe is actually beginning to spend more to support Ukraine now.
And about time. Europe's assumptions that peace with Russia could be taken for granted and that the Americans would be there to clean up if that assumption was wrong have been shattered. I think Germany has had 2 generations worth of assumptions about Russia gone. The French President Macron has shifted from endlessly reaching out to Russia to recognizing the Russian threat. And it turns out that the Polish and Baltic positions about Russia have been proven right. It's about time that Europe stepped up. This is absolutely essential. Regardless of who wins the US elections, we need a stronger Europe, we need a stronger Britain, because our adversaries are in earnest. Putin is an aggressive dictator along, shall we say, 20th century lines. I don't know that President Xi of China will follow the same path with respect to Taiwan, but we have to be ready. It would be nice to say that the military balance of power is a consideration that belongs to the 20th century, but it belongs to the 21st. It's our issue right now.
And how much do you think that increase in defence spending amongst European nations, particularly European NATO members, is a recognition of the Russian threat? And how much of it is just, frankly, a concern that Donald Trump could return to the White House and that they can't rely on US spending on NATO to help to protect them?
I think it's the combination. I think the Russian threat is now real to Europeans who dismissed it until very recently. I think that the shock of Donald Trump's pronouncements about NATO has forced a lot of the Europeans to wake up and realize that military power is neither a luxury nor an anachronism. It is needed. that the European project and the free world order, if I can put it that way, are not self-sustaining automatically. We have to mean it. We have to put our backs into it. And an increase in military spending is important. I think the polls have gone up to 4% of their GDP, and they're going to go even higher. I think the West European countries need to increase their spending as well if we're going to get through this, and we can in very good shape if we put our backs to it.
Yeah, because as you say, Poland is getting up close to 4%. Britain now made that commitment to get to 2.5% by 2050, but many other NATO countries are still quite some way behind that, aren't they?
Well, the trends are moving in the right direction. The Poles, the Baltic countries are there. Germany needs to spend more. I know they've got economic problems because their industry was based on cheap energy from Russia, and that's no longer there. The French need to put more into their military, but the trends are moving in the right direction. And this is not because of American lecturing. It's because the threat from Putin appears real to Europeans, and because worries about the United States have grown. Whatever happens in our elections, and I personally hope Biden wins, we need a stronger Europe and a militarily strong UK.
As you say, we are still some months off the US election. It's going to be a close-fought thing. Given what Donald Trump has said about his commitment to NATO, he made those comments, perhaps slightly flippantly, saying, well, any NATO member who, if they're not spending enough on their own defence, I don't see why we should rush to help them, which, of course, would undermine one of the basic principles of the NATO alliance. And given what he has said about Russia and Ukraine in the past, if President Trump did return to the White House, what do you think his approach to the war in Ukraine would be?
That's a key question. And I think it is possible that despite all his awful comments, which are based on what I consider to be an awful set of strategic assumptions that recall the America First movement of 1940 and 41, which was, by the way, indifferent to European security and British struggles against Hitler. I think despite this, there is a chance that Trump could shift his views. Some of the people around him have hinted that Trump would be prepared to take credit for the increases in European military spending and then claim that he saved NATO. I'm not saying Europeans have to like that, but they might find it in their interest if Trump is elected to accept it. It is also interesting to me that last week, just before the House of Representatives broke with the hard isolationist right and voted the assistance for Ukraine, Trump, in the middle of a tweet, acknowledged that Ukraine's survival and strength, his words, survival and strength was in American interest. That was the first time I think he's ever said that. I don't think he was saying that because he had had a shift in strategic orientation, but because he saw the way the debate in Congress was going. And if that's true, that means that, let's say, political opportunism might trump, so to speak, Donald Trump's strategic instincts. Now, I don't know this to be true, but it is at least worth considering. And I'm glad that the British Prime Minister and the Polish President have met with Trump. I think this sort of thing can be useful.
And just finally, of course, we're talking about that increase in Britain's defence spending, about the new package of aid from the United States, other European allies also sending more money to Ukraine. But of course, Russia is absolutely pouring money into its defence forces. I think it's 7.8%. It has vast numbers of conscripts and an economy very much geared up to ever-increasing defence spending. How great do you think are the risks at the moment that we could be reaching a turning point in the Ukraine war, with Russia facing the real prospect that it could win?
I think without the American aid, Russia stood a very good chance of winning the war. And that would have been a catastrophe, and it would have opened the way to yet more catastrophes. I think now the battle in Ukraine is open. I think the Ukrainians have a much greater chance of success. And if reasonable best case scenario for Ukraine, if the Ukrainians manage to blunt Russian land offensives this summer and strike deeper into Russian and Russian-held territory, Putin's war may turn against him. And in that case, Russian history over the past 150 years shows that when Russia starts aggressive wars and loses, political change can follow. I would not assume that Putin's position is great if he loses. If Russia does not succeed in its war, Putin's position could become difficult. And the notion that Russia never loses a war, or just because Putin is committed to this war means he automatically will win, is ahistoric. It doesn't matter how committed he is, he might lose. We have to think not just what Putin's going to do to us, but what we're going to help the Ukrainians do to him.
Daniel Fried, former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, also a former US ambassador to Poland. Really good to speak to you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.